Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Helene. I'm a creative writer and a transformation mentor, and I want to welcome you to Across Genres Creative Writing Week. And I want to thank you for joining tonight on this fourth session where we're going to be covering the novel. Just a couple housekeeping tidbits here. If you look below the presentation, you'll see a link to my website if you'd like to contact me, and also some information on how you can reach out to our guest speaker tonight. I also want to encourage you to like and subscribe. And I also want to mention, if you missed any of our first three sessions, they're up on this YouTube channel. And I would highly encourage you to go back and listen to them. We had creative nonfiction on Monday night, short story on Tuesday, both of those covered by the wonderful writer Bridget Shade. We had memoir yesterday with the amazing writer Maureen O'Brien. And so today I'm especially excited to introduce and welcome in our guest speaker, Jennifer Givhan, who is an accomplished and talented across genre writer. So welcome, Jen, and thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join with us. And I think I'm going to turn it over to you. If you will tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here, Karen. I'm so excited to talk about the novel with you. So I am a poet and novelist and now a screenwriter as well, because during the pandemic, I decided to adapt one of my novels into a screenplay. So just adding to my toolkit, and a young adult novelist as well. Also during the pandemic, I was homeschooling my kids, and my 10-year-old daughter and I decided to write a novel together, which is now agented and out looking for a home with publishers. So I definitely write across the genres. It's quite the joy of mine to, and not only writing across genres, but writing within the genres and bending genres. And so magical realism, thriller, there's psychological thriller, a literary novel. So I just love putting all the pieces together. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. I'm a mom. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I am also a transformational coach, and I teach and encourage and empower writers to transform their writing lives and their own lives as a result. So thank you so much for having me here.
That's so exciting, Jen, and I know that you also work with, we're getting a feedback here and I'm not sure why.
Okay, how's that?
Let's see. Okay, might be a little better now, let's hope. Well, luckily you'll be doing most of the talking, so I just wanted to tell you, I love magical realism. I love psychological thriller. So that's really cool that you do all that and combine it with the literary. Those are all areas of interest of mine. I'm wondering about what writers in the field of novel, what authors that you've been drawn to, and how they may have impacted your work, if they have, if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the earliest novelists that influenced me, and probably many of us writers across the genres, is Toni Morrison. And so I read her novel Beloved when I was 16 years old in high school and going through a very difficult trauma myself as a teenage girl. And so that was one of the formative experiences for me, was being able to put into words onto the page in story form, not only the trauma itself and that it was okay. I felt like I had the empowerment and the permission, from a woman of color to write about trauma. And then also to, write about healing as well, right? And write about the societal aspects that also engendered and allowed that trauma to take place. And then, the healing. And so in that novel, Beloved, when Setha goes after, instead of this time her own family, her own beloveds, right? She goes after the slave owner, right? Instead, and turns her rage outward. That was really a pivotal moment in my life, and would become a touchstone for me as a writer, and how I would be able to transform my characters and in many ways my own self, and grow with my novels, so that my protagonists, right? I would write these protagonists and characters who then would teach me what I needed to know in my own life. And so I often felt, whenever I'm reading a Toni Morrison novel, that, the book is so wise. And as a poet, we often say the poem knows better than we do, right? The poem is going to teach us. The poem is wise. And that's the spirit that I got from Toni Morrison's very lyrical writing. She's a wise woman that has something to teach, but the characters themselves were so wise. And so I was able to imbue my characters with the wisdoms that I hadn't always seen, especially because I started writing at such a young age. And so I had wise women in my life, but it's so easy to ignore and to get to rebel against the wise women in our lives. But when their voices, Karen, you and I were talking a little bit beforehand about voice, when their voices would enter the novel, right? And then I would start to hear it through the voices of my characters. There was something, there was a magic happening there, a transformation that then allowed me to absorb that wisdom. And so I hope I carry that with me into each new novel. So Toni Morrison absolutely is a foremother of mine. A more recent author that influenced me quite a bit is Victor Lavalle. And I read his book, The Changeling. It's wonderful if you haven't read it. And I was actually happened to be in New York. I took my family with me for BookCon, where I was invited by my publisher to sign copies and present from my first novel, Trinity Sight, which I have here with me, which is also magical realism and apparently borders on horror as well, although I hadn't known that, but it makes sense. Victor Lavalle writes horror. So I was in New York, and The Changeling actually takes place in New York. And so there was this really kind of kismet, moment of synchronicity, where I'm on the subway for the first time in my life, reading about someone giving birth on the subway. And I was just, oh my gosh, this is so formative for me. And so I just love the way that, fiction and life mirror each other. And that's something that I'm constantly looking for and trying to create in my own novels and with the world building that's happening there. So again, Victor Lavalle crosses genres, magical realism, horror, literary novel, maybe part almost graphic novel type of, kind of just the vibe to it. It's not illustrated, but just kind of the vibe. And, I remember just really enjoying that and adapting some of those styles into my own, my newest novel, which is coming out next year from Blackstone Publishing, is called River Woman, River Demon. And it's a psychological thriller that is about the protective magic of people of color here in the Southwest border. And so I think of it as like the Chicana or Latinx girl on the train, right? Because I am Latina, and I so often don't see my culture and people, Latinas represented in the literature, in the movies, and so I love thrillers. And I wasn't seeing Latinas in thrillers, and I wasn't seeing the Southwest in psychological thrillers, so I wrote one. And I feel like Victor Lavalle did that really well with writing people of color into the horror genre.
That's really interesting, and you're so prolific and high energy that you must have some good inspiration to keep you going. I wanted to ask you, because we were talking about voice and we were talking about new voices coming onto the scene. And as a novelist, I think about the voice of the author as being so important, and also the voice of the character that are in the novel. And I'm wondering how you think of that, and how do you think they mesh together or feed off each other or support each other?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I experimented with that quite a bit in my most recent novel, which is written in the first person. And so my novels previously had been written in the third person. And so, I wanted to get closer, if I could, to, what I would consider kind of the authentic voice of the author, right? And so I thought about that in terms of poetry. We're talking about crossing genres. And I was trying to figure out, I'm writing a novel that is dealing with an unreliable narrator. And in my first novel, Jubilee, which I have here as well, so just a little plug here for my heart work. This was my second published novel, but actually the first that I ever wrote. And I have an unreliable narrator in Jubilee as well. And I had a tough time trying to decide, am I going to write in third person, first person? Because she is dealing with trauma, PTSD, and mental health issues. And so, in that one, there is another character, her new love, Joshua, and he, is able to see and filter for the reader, what the reader would find maybe difficult to understand in her mental health struggles. And so I kept that one third person to give some space there for the reader. But in a thriller, you want the reader to be as unstable as possible,
Mm-hmm.
And so I played with that idea of the first person because, the subjective I is one that I love so much in poetry, whether it's the actual poet or not, right? We don't ever think of the speaker or we're not supposed to think of the speaker as being the poet, right? Because you can take on a persona. And I so often like to use the I as also the lens, right? The eye that we see through of witness. And so there's something about, capturing that voice in the eye that is like, that brings the reader closer. Like, come listen, I have a story to tell you, right? And so that's what I was playing with my unreliable narrator in my third novel. So, just in terms of voice and the author's voice, it is interesting kind of the transformation that takes place because I feel like there's so much freedom in taking on this character, right? And they might take on aspects of myself, right? But then there's just so much play and so much, liberty really that happens when I just get to be someone else entirely,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's about, I find I learn things about myself and about the world, and it's almost like I didn't know that I knew that, or I didn't know, and there's a level of learning to trust myself as a writer and as a person, and that when I'm able to take on these multiple voices, these multiple characters, I discover facets of myself. Maybe it's through empathy, right? I think that novelists tap into that empathetic skill. And so many of us are natural empaths. All writers, I think, are natural empaths. And so tapping into that skill, and so I'd read that that people who read, right, are more likely to be more empathetic and more compassionate people. And I feel like that's a skill that has really been honed for me as a writer as well, when I'm able to step into those multiple viewpoints. And so I only take on writing about, or my protagonists have mostly been Latina women. One, as I said, we're not represented as we should be in the literature. And two, because, I think that I want to make sure that I'm being respectful and that I'm not appropriating anyone's stories that I don't have access to, right?
Mm-hmm.
But one of my protagonists, one of my main characters in my second novel is a Black man, and he's modeled very closely after my partner. And so I would often talk to my partner, and I'd read passages to my partner and ask, and try to get as close to his experience, as I could, without appropriating his story. And so anyway, I feel like there's just such a respectful stepping into someone else's experience, right? That allows for growth as a person and as a writer that I've really enjoyed since seeing myself as a novelist. It's a skill that I feel that I've developed that's been useful to me in my life.
That's really informative and very interesting. I'm wondering if you would like to read a short passage from one of your published pieces.
Sure.
You don't have to, but we would love to hear it if you would like to share with us.
Absolutely. And I will show you actually how my poetry informs my fiction. And so really any passage that I chose to read would come across as a poem because they're plotted. I sit down and I get my scene plan out and I plot each novel beginning to end, because I need that as a poet. I really need to have that kind of plan for myself. But within that, when I have that skeletal structure mapped out, I'm then able to just go in and infuse it with the lyricism that just runs through my veins. So this is a passage where Bianca is the protagonist of Jubilee.
Okay.
And she's come home with a baby doll that she believes is her daughter, Jubilee. And she mothers this baby doll. And she meets someone new. She's back in college. She's 20 years old. She meets someone who then has to decide what he's going to do about this doll, and he's already fallen in love with her by the time that he realizes what's happening, because he started falling in love with her at college where she didn't bring the doll. And so he has to decide what he's going to do. So let me give you, let's see. So this is them together, kind of a scene where they have made love, and where you're getting the idea of what's happened to Bianca, piece by piece, clue by clue, that's led her to this moment with the doll. In the story of La Llorona, a woman comes unhinged from unrequited love. She drowns herself by drowning her babies. She is lost. She is gone forever to the riverbank, and her song sounds of death. This is no kind of ending. This is no kind of love. Rivers take, yes, but rivers bring back. Joshua came inside Bianca with such sweetness. I know of a river that empties into a gulf in the belly of Mexico. I know of an ocean that belly spills into. Of salt I must drink, brindled fish I've become. Salt on my skin, my lover is drinking too. I know of a cycle that carries away what is clean, what is made clear. I know rain. I am rain. Love, let me rain into you. I know groundwater, fresh water. Oh, love, the river is coming. Listen, she's singing again. So that's a passage that describes Bianca's internal state of being. And you get quite a few through bits and pieces, through memory, through poetry, and then through a timeline that is in the past, set in the past. That's in Bianca's voice. And then in the present tense, you get Joshua's voice, primarily, where he stands in for the reader, and he's able to see her the way that the reader sees her, and really solve the mystery of what's happened to her and whether or not she will recover and heal from whatever trauma she has undergone.
That was really beautiful, Jen. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you so
And
much.
very poetic. I loved all the water reference, and see how well it works to, support what the passage is about. And that was, I love any nature references. And so I especially love the way you use the river, particularly in that. I do want to mention we have a couple comments from Lori, actually. She commented earlier when you were talking about your characters. I get to be someone else entirely. Great selling point for giving novel writing a role. And then after your passage, wowee, that Jubilee passage. So
Thank Thank
I
you,
have to agree
Lori.
with that. Um, Before we do, and I wanted to ask you about, I know that you talk about in revising, and these are words that I've used and I really like them, that you talk about um, creative destruction, and then about how revision is transformation. And I love that because it applies not only to our writing our novel, but like you were saying before, for those of us that work in the transformation field, I'm always working with story, and I always think of it as like that creative chaos, and then how we can transform ourselves by using story. So that fascinates me as both a writer and my interest in transformation. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what you mean in those processes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've recently listened to Brene Brown on Netflix, and she articulates so well one of the ideas that I've long held, that any fear, any emotion, any, whatever it is that we are feeling is really whatever story our brain is telling us, right? It's a story that we tell ourselves. So the circumstances themselves are neutral, right? But then the meaning that we bring to it, the meaning that we imbue it with, is the story that we're telling ourselves. And we can tell ourselves a different story, right? And so that's how I think of transformation in whatever we're writing, as a poet, as a novelist, and what's been so healing to me personally. Just in terms of revising our work, let me pull up my notes here on creative destruction. So on revising our work, I think of revision as transformation, that we revise the way we see our stories and the revision process as we're going through. And so on the first round, right, of writing, we just have to get the whole thing out, and I always say, just say the darn thing. You have to get it out of you, because I'm not, this is more about in the revision process, right? But so I think about, like, how do we re-see the story? How do we, what when we go back into it, right? And so and this could actually happen, and a lot of times does happen, when I write the scene plan and then I go to the story itself, and then there's some re-seeing once I get to the end, because what it really is about for me is what Lisa Crone in Story Genius calls the third rail, which is not just what happens in the external conflict, right? But about the internal conflict of the protagonist, what their internal struggle is. And to know that, you have to know, their whole life up to the point that you meet them in the novel. And you have to know the end of the novel. You have to know, right, what ultimately happens, whether they get it or not. And so I'll use Jubilee as an example to show you how revision can change. So when I'd originally written the very first draft of the novel, the ending that happens, I sent it to my mom, and she read every draft through. And it wasn't until, and I've revised this novel, over 10 years, I want to say 10 times. And I'm talking deep revisions, right? It was the novel that I learned how to write a novel through. And so I finally, my mom was watching my kids for me so that I could do this final revision and send it off to my publisher. The end, they're publishing it. That's it. This is my last chance for a revision. And I'm sitting there at the kitchen table. Tears are just running down my eyes. And I say, all of a sudden, I know what I have to do. And I change the ending completely, right? And I send it to my mom. And I'm just sobbing, and she comes back to me, and I said, what did you think of the ending? And she said, this is how I thought it was in the very beginning. Isn't this the original, like the very first ending that you ever wrote? And I was like, it felt like it was what needed to always be the ending. And I think that, I don't think it was the original ending, no. But I think maybe she and I had talked about it at some point, and like part of me knew that's what had to happen. Right. But I had to go through that process with the protagonist and learn with her before I could finally find out, right, what ultimately. And so, anyway, it's a kind of, in poetry, we call it the expanding and contracting, right? We take out to contract it, and then we put more in and we expand it, and we go through that a few times. And I feel like I've used that process in my novels. And so it's been a cyclical, revision becomes cyclical for me, so that when I get to the ending, it's vastly different than what I thought it was going to be, because I've learned alongside the protagonist and I've made different choices, right? When I sit down and I plan it, I don't know, I haven't gone through the journey yet necessarily, not with that protagonist, right? And so I envision an ending, but by the time I actually go through the journey with the protagonist, that ending has changed. So then I have to go back to the beginning, right? And figure out, okay, what do I need to change to get to this ending? And then it becomes a process of, a cyclical process where the protagonist is changing me, the writer, really, and I'm learning alongside them. And so that's creative destruction, right? You have to be willing to go in and destroy your story a little bit, right? Again and again. You had this beautiful thing. It all worked out in your scene plan. And then you're going to go in and you're going to throw a wrench in it. What? Because that's going to get deeper inside the internal struggle, which is what story is all about. That's why we are, let me tell you what happened when, and our ears are going to perk up, because we want to know, what does the storyteller know that I need to learn in my own life, right? What lesson can I learn from them? So, yeah. Thank you for that question.
That's really good. Before I do ask you to give us a prompt, there was one thing I wanted to just get a quick response from you on, because you are so prolific and you've tackled all these different genres. It seems like you're fearless when it comes to that. And so what advice can you give to someone who, you have to keep facing that, or at least the rest of us have to keep facing that rejection. And so how do you keep your motivation? And how do you fearlessly go on to, hey, I want to write a screenplay and I know I can do it, if I attempt that. So.
Right. Absolutely. That is such a great question. So in terms of rejection, one of the things that I've learned recently is that a no is not necessarily a rejection. Just like I was saying, a circumstance is neutral, right? It's a response. And how I choose to take that response is up to me. I get to make the decision about whether I call it a rejection or not. And so in the past, I've been very, I'm going to paper my walls with rejections is the saying, and rejection slips are my tickets into the game, right? And I love the way that Brene Brown talks about being dauntless, getting into the arena, and that's winning. Just being in the arena itself with the blood, sweat, and tears there, that's winning. So that's how I've seen it primarily, is just, until I get those rejections, right? Am I really in it? Have I put my heart in it? Mm-hmm. And so, and that's how I've seen it, because I know that ultimately it's a numbers game, right? Because, we have to just keep trying, and it becomes a percentage, right? And so I know that my acceptance rate is a certain percentage. And I like to think about that. That's actually what got me through the pandemic, is that my brain just thinks that way in terms of statistics. And I'm like, because, my odds of dying at any given day are such and such, I'm just going to be brave, And so that's how I kind of am about because I'm a hypochondriac. And so when the pandemic first hit, I was like, well, I can curl up into a ball right now and stay here the whole time because I'm so terrified. Or I can see, these are the statistics. This is what I can do to protect myself, right? And go from there. So that's how I live my writer's life as well, right? I don't like rejection. It's painful. I cry sometimes. I will go eat half a tub of ice cream or whatever's left in that tub of ice cream when I get a major rejection that that my heart was pinned to. But ultimately, it's a numbers game. And my story is so important. And I think that's for all of us, right? Something brought us to the page day after day after day, right? Brought us to the revision day after day after day. We poured our soul into that. We know that it's important. It's not for everyone, but it was important enough to us that we know that there are others who need it too. And so that's the confidence that really keeps me here, keeps me in the game, in the arena. And I will put up with those. And I'm looking at now as it's a no, it's an answer. Okay, I don't have to take it as a rejection. And I'm no longer actually taking it into myself the way that I used to. So yeah, I would say just hold on to whatever it was that brings you to the page. Get yourself your tub of ice cream or your chocolate or your whatever it is. It's going to get you through the immediate moment. And then the very next day, get back into the arena. It's too important not to. Your story is too important not to. Yeah.
Yeah, very well said. Since we are running out of time, I do want to just mention before I ask Jen to leave us with a prompt that we can all give our hand a try at. Tomorrow evening is poetry with Lorinda Lynn, so I hope you'll join us then. And Jen, if you have a prompt to end us with, we would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was talking about the third rail, which is the internal logic that keeps us. That's in Lisa Cron's Story Genius. And I've also recently been reading Shonda Rhimes' The Yes Year. And she's a television writer, and she talks about laying down the track. And the train is coming, and you just have to keep laying down the track. And so I think of this in terms of world building, right? That you just have that. So I think of laying down the track as kind of weaving in the elements of internal and external and plot, right? So I build the world. I give my protagonist's reaction to it. How are they feeling about it? And then how does this launch them into the future, right? Into the plot, right? How does this propel forward? And so I want us to think about that with this prompt. So you have to lay down the track, build the world, and it could be like every other sentence as you weave it together, right? So external element, internal element, some kind of question or, questioning of circumstance then that happens that propels the movement forward. So something is happening to the speaker that propels them forward. I keep saying speaker. I'm a poet at heart. I can't help that. You know what I mean. And so then the prompt itself, hang on real quick. Let me find it here. Okay. I can't find it on my computer, but I'll just say dream logic, right? And so I write magical realism. So I want you to just write, as if it were a dream. So if you're bringing the element of dream logic into it, magical real, the surreal, right? Something extraordinary that wouldn't probably happen in your real life, but how can you bring that element, that surreal twist into the story as you're thinking about building the world around the speaker, how they're reacting to it, and then what is the next movement forward that's propelling the plot forward. So that's my prompt for you. Be surreal, build the world around the speaker. How are they reacting to it? And then propel them forward in time.
That's a great prompt. We'll be writing. We can all write if we listen to all of them. They're all such good prompts. They'll keep us writing for a while, so that will be very helpful. Jen, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I hope if we do this again, you'll come back because you're just full of great information. And of course, we could probably talk for several hours. So I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode. And again, thank you so much, Jen. We will talk to you again soon. Bye, everyone.
Take care.